Millionaire abandoned wife for model. She arrived at his wedding in Limo with triplets. The words didn't slice. They sanitized. Julian Thorne, a man who built an empire on calculated risks, was now eliminating one. "The marriage is no longer a viable asset, Alara," he said, the skyline of the city he'd conquered gleaming behind him like a crown of cold jewels. His voice, once the anchor of her world, was now the sterile tone of a press release. He slid a leather-bound portfolio across the polished expanse of his desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. "The settlement is more than generous. It is, of course, contingent upon your signature on a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." He didn't look at her. He looked at the future, a future she was not in. "I am marrying Serafina Dubois. The wedding is in 6 months." And in that moment, as her world dissolved into the silent hum of the penthouse air conditioning, the only sound Alara could hear was the frantic, desperate flutter of 3 tiny heartbeats inside her, a secret he had just rendered utterly worthless. Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now, let's dive in. Their beginning hadn't been in a penthouse. It had been in a garage. Not a trendy Silicon Valley garage, but a damp, oil-stained box in a forgotten suburb, smelling of rust and ambition. Julian Thorne, then, was not a name but a verb, a relentless force of creation. He had blueprints in his eyes and engine grease under his fingernails. Alara Vance wasn't his asset, she was his architect. While he wrestled with code and soldering irons, she built the scaffolding of their life. She organized the chaos, paid the bills with her meager paralegal salary, and believed in the man whose dreams were too big for their tiny apartment. She remembered the night he finally cracked the algorithm for his revolutionary logistics software Nexus. He hadn't celebrated with champagne. He had collapsed into her arms, weeping with an exhaustion so profound it felt holy. "We did it, Elle," he'd whispered into her hair, his body trembling. "Not me. We." In that moment, they were a single entity, fused by shared struggle and unwavering faith. She was the steady hand that held the compass while he charted the stars. She proofread his patents, negotiated with his first, skeptical suppliers, and calmed him during the panic attacks that came like clockwork in the dead of night, when the fear of failure was a physical monster in the room. The money, when it came, was a tidal wave. First a trickle, then a stream, then a biblical flood that swept them from their cramped apartment and deposited them into the stratosphere of wealth. The garage was replaced by a glass tower. The greasy rags were replaced by bespoke suits. Julian Thorne, the verb, became Julian Thorne, the brand, and something inside him began to calcify. The late-night talks about dreams were replaced by strategy sessions about market share. The shared, exhausted weeping was replaced by a solitary, steely-eyed focus. Alara tried to hold on to the man from the garage. She hosted intimate dinners, hoping to find him again in the laughter of old friends. But he would remain distant, his mind clearly on quarterly reports. She tried to lure him away on spontaneous trips to the coast, to the kind of wind-swept, anonymous places where they had once felt most like themselves. But his phone was a phantom limb, an extension of his will that never ceased its buzzing. He was a king now, and a king has no time for the quiet memories of the man he once was. He started speaking of legacy as if it were a fortress to be built, not a life to be lived. "Image is everything, Alara," he would say, his gaze sweeping over her sensible, elegant dresses with a new, critical light. "Perception is reality." He was no longer building a company, he was curating a dynasty. The first time he mentioned Serafina Dubois, it was with the same detached tone he used to discuss a corporate acquisition. "She's the new face of the Thorne Foundation's global campaign, a significant social media footprint. Excellent optics." Alara had seen the pictures. Serafina was a sculpture of a woman, flawless and breathtaking, a living embodiment of the polished, inhuman perfection Julian now worshipped. She was not a partner, she was a jewel, the final, perfect stone to be set in his crown. Alara felt the shift, not as a sudden earthquake, but as a slow, tectonic drift. He was moving away from her, from their shared history, from the garage and the late-night fears and the sacred promise of we. He was calving off the part of his life that reminded him of vulnerability, of struggle. of the man who once needed her to hold him together. When she discovered she was pregnant, a fragile hope flickered within her. A child, a legacy not of steel and glass, but of flesh and blood. A reason to return to the beginning. She planned a special dinner, a quiet moment to bring him back to the we that had been their genesis. But he canceled. A last-minute trip to Zurich. He canceled the next night, too. A merger. Finally, she walked into his office. The positive pregnancy test clutched in her purse like a talisman. He was on the phone, his back to her, looking out at his kingdom. "The metrics are undeniable," he was saying. "It's a clean cut, minimal fallout." He turned, saw her, and his face did not soften. It sharpened. He ended the call. And then came the speech. The sanitized corporate execution. The marriage was no longer a viable asset. The settlement, the NDA. He never gave her the chance to tell him. As he spoke of Serafina and the wedding, her secret became a lead weight in her stomach. It was a truth that no longer had any market value in the empire of Julian Thorne. She walked out of that glass tower, the leather portfolio in her hand, feeling like a ghost. He hadn't just left her, he had unwritten her from his history. Back in the silent, cavernous penthouse that was once their home, she sank onto the floor and finally let the sobs come, her hands protectively wrapped around her abdomen. It was no longer just her he had abandoned. He had abandoned them, all four of them. And in the depths of that soul-crushing despair, a new feeling began to germinate. It was cold, it was hard, and it was patient. It was not hatred, it was resolve. He wanted to erase his past. She would, in her own time, force a reckoning with it. The 6 months that followed were a crucible. Julian Thorne, in his infinite, callous efficiency, had ensured Alara wanted for nothing materially. A sprawling, sun-drenched villa in a quiet coastal town appeared in her name, staffed and secured. Funds, vast and silent, flowed into a private account. It was a golden cage, designed to keep her comfortable, silent, and invisible. He was paying for her absence, outsourcing the messy business of a discarded life. But he had miscalculated. He had assessed Alara as a liability to be managed, not as a woman with a spine of forged steel. She did not languish in her gilded prison. The shock gave way to a profound maternal ferocity. She was no longer just Alara. She was a vessel, a guardian. Her body, once a source of betrayal and heartbreak, became a sacred space. Her days fell into a quiet rhythm. Prenatal yoga, long walks on the beach where the salt spray felt like a baptism, and hours spent in the library of her new home. She wasn't reading fiction, she was studying. She read about single parenting, about early childhood development, about trust funds and estate planning. She was building an ark for her children, a world where they would be defined by their mother's love, not their father's absence. Then came the day of the ultrasound. The technician, a kind woman with gentle eyes, glided the wand over her belly. "Well," the woman said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "there's one healthy heartbeat." She paused, repositioning the wand. "And there's the second one." Alara's breath caught in her throat. 2 twins. A wave of terror and joy washed over her. Before she could fully process it, the technician's eyes widened slightly. "Oh my. Hold on a moment." She zoomed in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Would you look at that? Hello, little one." She turned the screen towards Alara. 1, 2, and 3. "Congratulations, Mama. You've got a full house. Triplets." The word echoed in the small, dark room, a pronouncement of fate. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. It was a secret of such magnitude that it felt like a weapon. That night she didn't cry. She sat on her veranda, watching the moon rise over the ocean, and she laughed. A low, throaty laugh that started in her belly and filled the night air. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been handed a cosmic joke of divine proportions. Julian, the master planner, the king of controlled outcomes, had created a chaotic, beautiful, triplicate secret that was growing, day by day, outside the bounds of his meticulously crafted world. Meanwhile, the world was saturated with Julian and Serafina. They were on the cover of magazines, their perfect faces smiling out from a world of impossible glamour. "The power couple redefining legacy," one headline blared. Another, an exclusive interview with Serafina, was titled, "I'm not marrying a millionaire, I'm marrying a visionary." In the article, Serafina spoke of Julian's desire for a family, when the time is right. She spoke of their shared vision for a streamlined, impactful life. Ilara read the words without bitterness. It was like watching a play, a piece of theater so disconnected from reality that it was almost comical. Julian wasn't a visionary. He was an editor, cutting out any part of the story that didn't fit his narrative. The birth was an ordeal of fire and grace. 2 boys, Liam and Noah, and a girl, Chloe. They were tiny, fragile, and perfect. Looking at their 3 sleeping faces, Ilara felt a love so fierce it was a physical force. They were her world, her purpose, her everything. The ghost of Julian Thorne, the man in the glass tower, faded into insignificance, replaced by the overwhelming reality of these 3 miraculous lives. She hired a small, trusted staff, a nanny, a chef, a security guard, all of whom were women who had faced their own hardships. Her villa became a quiet matriarchy, a sanctuary of resilience. As the months turned into a year, then 2, then 3, Julian's attempts to enforce the silence of the NDA became more pronounced. A lawyer would call her own, a man she had hired who was as shrewd as he was loyal. There were concerns about a photo a local had snapped of her with the children on the beach. There were gentle reminders about the terms of the agreement. Julian was a ghost who haunted the periphery of her life, a distant, paranoid king checking the locks on his gilded cage. Ilara's resistance was a masterclass in subtlety. She never breached the contract. She never spoke his name. She simply lived. She lived a full, vibrant, and visible life within her small town. She donated to the local library her name, Ilara Vance, engraved on a small brass plaque. She funded a new wing for the pediatric ward at the local hospital. She was not a recluse. She was a pillar. Her power was not in what she said, but in the life she built, a life that stood as a silent testament to the one he had discarded. The children grew. Liam was quiet and observant, with Julian's intense eyes. Noah was a whirlwind of energy, a boisterous, laughing boy. And Chloe was the diplomat, a serious little girl with a wisdom that seemed ancient. Ilara never lied to them. As they grew old enough to ask, she told them a simple, unadorned truth. Your father was a man who had a very important job, and he couldn't be a father too. But you were made from so much love, a love so big it had to be split into 3. The announcement of Julian's wedding anniversary, their 5th, was the catalyst. It wasn't a quiet affair. It was to be the social event of the decade, a grand ball at his sprawling country estate, renewing his vows with Serafina. The theme, blasted across every society page, was legacy and a look to the future. It was a monument to his own curated reality. That was when Ilara decided. It was time, not for revenge. Revenge was a small, petty thing. This was about a reckoning, a moral audit. Her lawyer advised against it. "You're poking the dragon, Ilara." "The dragon has been asleep for 5 years," she replied, her voice calm. "It's time for him to be reminded of what he burned down." Her plan began to take shape, meticulous and precise. She wasn't going to crash the wedding. She was going to make an appearance, an arrival. A statement not of words, but of presence. She started digging, not into his finances, but into his history. The official story was that Julian Thorne was a self-made man, a genius who sprang from nothing. But Ilara had been there. She remembered faint, dismissed stories about his father, a man Julian referred to only as a failed dreamer, a man who had died years ago alone and, according to Julian, a drunk. Something about it had never sat right. Julian's shame about his father was too venomous, too absolute. Using a private investigator, a discreet woman who specialized in finding forgotten people, Ilara started pulling at the threads. The investigator found a last known address for Arthur Thorne, a rundown boarding house in a forgotten industrial town. She found a storage locker, paid for in cash for years by an anonymous benefactor, the payments having stopped a few months after Arthur's death. Inside that locker, covered in a dusty tarp, was the ghost of another man's life. There were boxes of journals filled with elegant looping script. There were intricate schematics drawn with a draftsman's precision. And there was a prototype. A clunky, oversized version of a device that looked startlingly, terrifyingly familiar. It was a primitive version of the core hardware component that made Julian's Nexus's system possible. Ilara spent a week with those journals, the air in her library thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. The story they told was not of a failed dreamer or a drunk. It was the story of a brilliant, gentle man named Arthur Thorne. A man obsessed with solving the puzzle of logistics, of creating a system that could connect the world more efficiently. A man who wrote about his son Julian with a heartbreaking mixture of pride and fear. "Julian has a fire in him," one entry read. "A fire I worry will consume the kindling of his own heart. He sees my work not as a passion, but as a failure to monetize. He has the mind of a predator, and I fear he sees me as prey." The final entries were a portrait of despair. Arthur described how Julian, then a ruthless young man on the rise, had visited him. He had belittled his work, called his prototypes toys, and offered him a pittance to sign away any and all intellectual property rights. Arthur had refused. 2 weeks later, his small workshop had a fire. An accident, the report said. All his primary research was destroyed. Shortly after, Julian Thorne launched his first company, built on a revolutionary concept that was, in fact, a polished, weaponized version of his own father's dream. The anonymous benefactor paying for the storage locker? Ilara suspected it was someone from Arthur's past, someone who knew. This was the truth. Julian Thorne wasn't a self-made man. He was a grave robber. He hadn't just abandoned his wife and children. He had built his entire empire on the tomb of his own father. The fortress of his legacy was built on a lie, cemented with the ashes of a man he had erased. Ilara closed the final journal, the leather cool beneath her fingers. Her heart wasn't pounding with rage. It was still with a terrible, clarifying calm. She now understood the hollowness in Julian's eyes, the paranoid obsession with control, the desperate need to build a flawless image. He wasn't protecting a legacy, he was hiding a crime not of law, but of the soul. The invitation to the wedding gala arrived as she knew it would, a courtesy, a final, arrogant reminder of the world she was excluded from. It sat on her desk, a cream and gold declaration of war. She picked up the phone and called a high-end limousine service. Then she called a designer in Paris, one known for creating bespoke evening gowns for children. The plan was no longer just an arrival. It was a resurrection. She wasn't just bringing his children to his door. She was bringing the ghost of his father. The day of the gala was a masterpiece of orchestrated perfection. Julian Thorne's country estate was transformed into an ethereal wonderland. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ancient oaks, a symphony orchestra played softly on the main lawn, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth. Julian stood on the grand steps of his Georgian manor, Serafina, a vision in diamond white, at his side. She was beautiful, poised, a perfect queen for his perfect kingdom. But Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. For 5 years, he had lived in a state of low-grade, vigilant paranoia. The Ilara situation had been handled. Yet the silence was, in its own way, unsettling. He'd expected a fight, a lawsuit, a messy tabloid scandal. He had received nothing. It was like dropping a stone into a well and never hearing it hit the bottom. The silence unnerved him more than any threat could. He scanned the convoy of luxury cars gliding up the long gravel driveway. Everything was as it should be. The titans of industry, the political power brokers, the socialites, all the chess pieces of his world were arriving, paying tribute to the legacy he had so meticulously constructed. And then he saw it. It was a limousine, but it was different from the others. It wasn't the ostentatious black of the new money crowd. It was a deep, classic Rolls-Royce silver, a vehicle of old-world elegance and undeniable power. It moved with a serene, unhurried grace, parting the sea of lesser cars. It didn't proceed to the guest drop-off. It glided to a stop directly at the base of the grand staircase, a place reserved for no one. The orchestra faltered for a moment, a violin squeaking in surprise. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Julian's blood ran cold. He knew with a primal certainty that defied logic who was in that car. His security chief, a burly ex-Mossad agent, started to move, but Julian raised a single sharp hand. "Hold!" The chauffeur, dressed in a classic gray uniform, opened the rear door. The first to emerge was a boy of about 5, dressed in a flawless miniature tuxedo. He had a serious, watchful expression and Julian's own intense dark eyes. He stood poised by the open door. Then came a second boy, nearly identical, but with a spark of mischief in his smile. He bounced slightly on the balls of his feet, taking in the scene with wide-eyed wonder. Finally, a little girl stepped out, her hand holding her brother's. She was in a simple, elegant dress the color of a pale dawn, her hair in a neat braid. She looked up at the grand house not with awe but with a calm, unnerving curiosity. They stood in a line, 3 perfect, impossible figures. The crowd fell into a stunned, absolute silence. They were Julian's face, his eyes, his jawline, mirrored 3 times. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Then Ilara emerged. She was not the woman he had dismissed. That woman was a memory, soft and pliable. This woman was a queen. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color that spoke of life, of resilience, of old money and unbreakable will. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the clean, strong lines of her neck and jaw. She wore no ostentatious jewels, only a simple, familiar gold locket. She was not there to scream or cause a scene. She was radiating a power so profound and self-contained, it made the glittering wealth around her look cheap and fragile. She took her children's hands. Together, the 4 of them began to ascend the stairs. Julian felt Serafina's hand tighten on his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Julian?" she hissed, her voice a thread of ice. "What is this?" He couldn't answer. His throat was closed. His carefully constructed world was fracturing, the sound of the cracking ice deafening in his ears. Every guest, every camera, every eye was on the silent, graceful procession coming up the stairs. Ilara stopped a few feet from them. She didn't look at Serafina. Her eyes, clear and steady, were locked on Julian. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice even and calm, carrying easily in the silent air. "Liam, Noah, Chloe, this is your father." The 3 children looked at him. There was no accusation in their eyes, only a quiet, searching curiosity. It was worse than any hatred. It was the look of strangers assessing a curious relic. Julian felt the world tilt, the blood roaring in his ears. This was the attack he had been dreading, the public detonation of his past. He opened his mouth to call for security, to unleash his lawyers, to do something. But Ilara spoke again, her voice dropping lower, for his ears only. "This isn't about them, not really." She took a small step closer, the scent of her perfume, the same one she used to wear in the garage, jasmine and salt, cutting through the expensive air. "It's about him." "Him?" Julian croaked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Arthur," she said, and the name was a key turning a lock deep in his soul. "I know about the journals. I know about the workshop fire. I know about the prototype." It was a direct hit, not to his reputation, not to his wealth, but to the rotten core of his very identity. The lie he had lived with for 20 years, the secret that powered his every ambition and every fear, was now reflected in the eyes of the woman he had cast aside. He stared at her, his mask of command utterly shattered. He saw no triumph in her face, no vicious glee. He saw something far more terrifying: pity. She had not come to destroy his future. She had come to force him to face his past. The children were not the weapon, they were the jury. The real evidence was the truth she held in her gaze. "He didn't die a failed dreamer, Julian," she said softly, her voice filled with a sorrow that was somehow for him. "He died a father whose son stole his legacy, and you've spent your entire life building a bigger, shinier tombstone to hide the crime." Serafina, hearing the name Arthur, saw the color drain from Julian's face. She saw the terror, raw and primal, that replaced his usual cold authority. She had spent 5 years as the flawless face of his empire, but in that instant, she understood she knew nothing of the man himself. She was just another asset in a portfolio built on sand. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from his arm. The climax was not a shout, it was a whisper. It was the silent, devastating implosion of a man's soul, witnessed by the world he had fought so hard to impress. Ilara had not crashed his party. She had held up a mirror, and the reflection was that of a monster he could no longer pretend not to see. The silence on the grand staircase was a living entity. It pressed in on Julian, suffocating him. The orchestra was a distant, irrelevant memory. The hundreds of guests were statues in a wax museum of his own making. The only real things in the universe were Ilara's unwavering eyes and the three small, silent figures standing beside her. "Get them out of here!" Julian finally managed, the words tearing from his throat, raw and ragged. It was an instinct, the command of a king whose castle had been breached. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked at his security chief, whose face was a mask of confusion and alarm. But Ilara did not flinch. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice retaining its impossible calm. "Not yet." She took another step, closing the distance until she stood directly before him. She reached into the small, elegant clutch she carried and retrieved not a weapon, not a legal document, but a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was Arthur Thorne's journal. She didn't open it. She held it out to him. "His legacy isn't the code in your servers, Julian. It's this. The story of the man you erased." Julian stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake. Memories, black and tar-like, flooded him. His father's workshop, smelling of solder and hope. The look of betrayal in his father's eyes when Julian had called his life's work junk. The acrid smell of smoke on the night of the fire, a smell he had convinced himself was the scent of progress. "What do you want, Ilara?" he snarled, a cornered animal. "Money? You want more money? Name a price. Just take them and go." It was the wrong thing to say. For the first time, a flicker of genuine anger crossed her face. "Money?" she repeated, her voice laced with a contempt that cut deeper than any shout. "You think this is about money? I have your money. I have the gilded cage you locked me in. I am not here for your currency, Julian. I am here for your soul." From the corner of his eye, he saw Serafina take a deliberate step back. Her face was pale, her expression one of dawning horror. She wasn't looking at the children. She was looking at him, at the stranger he had just become in front of her. The visionary she had married was crumbling into a panicked, snarling brute. "You will not do this to me," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage born of pure terror. "You will not destroy everything I've built." "You built nothing," Ilara countered, her voice dropping to an intense, piercing whisper. "You stole the foundation and have been terrified of a strong wind ever since. This entire life, this party, this house, this woman on your arm, it's all just a barricade against the ghost of your father. But the ghost is here now, Julian. He's standing right in front of you." He looked at Liam, at his serious, watchful eyes, so like Arthur's. He looked at the journal in Ilara's hand. The past and the present were colliding with the force of a particle accelerator, and he was at the epicenter. With a guttural cry, he lunged, not for Ilara, but for the journal. His hand shot out to snatch it, to destroy it, to hurl it into the darkness. But Liam, the quiet, watchful boy, moved. With a speed that was shocking in one so small, he stepped in front of his mother, placing his small body between her and Julian. He didn't cower. He stood his ground, his chin lifted, and stared up at his father with an expression of profound, adult-like disappointment. It was the look. The exact same look Arthur had given him in their final, terrible argument. Julian froze, his hand hovering in the air. The strength drained from his body. He wasn't just facing Ilara anymore. He was facing his father's ghost, embodied in the 5-year-old son he had never met. The cycle of his own sin was staring back at him. The spell was broken. The world came rushing back in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers from the crowd. Cameras, once discreetly documenting the party, were now brazenly flashing, capturing the tableau of ruin. The mogul, broken. The model, recoiling in disgust. The wronged wife, standing in quiet victory. And the 3 silent children who were the living proof of it all. Serafina had seen enough. The man she married was a carefully constructed fiction. The legacy she had bought into was a fraud. With a quiet, devastating finality, she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She moved with the deliberate grace of a woman extricating herself from a disaster, her white gown a retreating flag of surrender. She walked down the grand staircase through the stunned crowd and disappeared into the night. The queen had abdicated. Julian watched her go, but it barely registered. He was hollowed out, a shell. He lowered his hand, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. Ilara did not press her advantage. She simply placed the journal into the hands of her son, Liam. "This belongs to our family," she said softly, her eyes still on Julian. Then she took her children's hands once more. "It's time to go home." She turned, and with the same unhurried dignity with which she had arrived, led her children back down the stairs. The crowd parted for them as if for royalty. They were a portrait of unbreakable grace in a landscape of glittering wreckage. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Ilara paused and looked back at Julian, a solitary, pathetic figure standing amidst the ruins of his own party. She offered no parting shot, no final condemnation. Her expression was one of immense, tragic sadness. Then she turned, entered the waiting silver limousine, and was gone. The orchestra remained silent. The guests, unsure what to do, began to quietly disperse, melting back into the darkness, leaving Julian Thorne alone on the steps of his empty monument, the flashes of the lingering paparazzi like the last mocking flicker of a fire that had consumed everything. The climax of his life was not a triumph, but the deafening silence of a legacy exposed as a lie. The aftermath was a brutal public autopsy. The story was a supernova in the media, the images of Ilara's regal arrival and Serafina's stark departure playing on a continuous loop. Thorne's triple secret, the empire of lies. The narrative Julian had spent 2 decades meticulously crafting was dismantled overnight. His company's stock plummeted. Board members convened emergency meetings. His kingdom, which had seemed so invincible, proved to be a house of cards. Julian did not fight it. He vanished. He retreated to the country estate, now a mausoleum of his hubris, and cut off all contact. He fired his public relations team, ignored the frantic calls from his lawyers, and locked the gates. For days, he wandered the empty, cavernous rooms, the faint scent of expensive flowers from the gala, now a cloying smell of decay. He drank. He didn't eat. He stared at his own reflection in the black mirrored surfaces of his modern furniture and saw a stranger. His rock bottom was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding descent into the truth. The ghost Ilara had spoken of was now his constant companion. The ghost of his father, Arthur. The ghost of the man he could have been. One night, in a fit of drunken despair, he stormed into his state-of-the-art home office, a room that had once been his command center, and began to destroy it. He swept billion-dollar contracts off his desk, smashed monitors, and tore books from their shelves. In his rampage, he uncovered something his staff had packed away from his old penthouse, a box of Ilara's things they had been meaning to ship to her. On top of the box was a small, sealed package. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was Arthur's journal. Ilara hadn't taken it with her. She had left it for him. It was not a weapon she had wielded. It was a key she had offered. He sat on the floor amidst the wreckage of his office, the journal in his lap. And for the first time in his adult life, he read his father's words. He read through the night, the rising sun casting long shadows across the room. He read about his father's hopes, his frustrations, his brilliant, gentle mind at work. He read the passages about himself, the ones filled with love and a growing, terrible fear. He saw his own youthful arrogance, his cruel ambition, through his father's pained, loving eyes. He did not find an accusation in those pages. He found a eulogy, for a relationship he had murdered, for a man he had never allowed himself to know, and for the son he had failed to be. When he finished the last page, Julian Thorne finally broke. He curled up on the cold floor, clutching his father's journal to his chest, and sobbed. It wasn't the cathartic weeping of the man in the garage. It was the racking, soul-tearing grief of a man mourning his own soul. His transformation was not a lightning strike of revelation. It was a slow, painful, and quiet process, marked not by grand gestures, but by small, consistent acts of atonement. His first action was invisible to the world. He used a shell corporation to establish a foundation, the Arthur Initiative. Its mission was simple: to provide grants to overlooked independent inventors and creators, the failed dreamers of the world. He funded it with a significant portion of his personal, non-corporate wealth. It was anonymous, uncelebrated work. It was penance. His second action was to write a letter, not to the board, not to the press, but to Ilara. He didn't use a computer or have an assistant type it. He wrote it by hand on simple, plain paper. It took him a week to write the first one. It wasn't an apology. He knew the word was meaningless. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. "I've been reading his journals," he wrote. "I never knew him. I saw him as an obstacle to my own ambition, an embarrassment. I realize now that my entire life has been a frantic effort to prove him wrong, and in doing so, I became a grotesque parody of the success I thought I wanted. I didn't just steal his work, I stole his memory. I don't know what to do with that truth, other than to finally admit that it is the truth." He sent it via a simple postal service, with no expectation of a reply. He wrote another a week later, and another the week after that. They were reflections, fragments of a man dismantling his own lies, piece by painful piece. He wrote about his fear of failure, a fear he now understood was a projection of how he had viewed his father. He wrote about the hollowness of his life with Serafina, a relationship built on brand synergy instead of human connection. Ilara read every letter. She did not reply. She simply watched and she waited. His third and most terrifying action was to reach out about the children. He didn't send a lawyer demanding visitation. He sent a short handwritten note to Ilara. "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to send me a recent photograph of them? I want to see their faces." Ilara sent back a single school photograph. Liam, Noah, and Chloe smiling, their personalities shining through. Julian placed it on the desk in his now repaired office, next to an old, faded picture of his father he had found in the journal. His two legacies, one he had created and abandoned, the other he had destroyed and mourned. Slowly, carefully, a fragile line of communication began to open, arbitrated entirely by Ilara. Julian's actions were always tentative, always respectful of her authority as their mother. He asked about their interests. Ilara told him Chloe was a budding artist, Noah was obsessed with building elaborate Lego cities, and Liam was a quiet reader, a lover of science. For Liam's 6th birthday, Julian didn't send an expensive toy. He sent a first-edition copy of a book on astrophysics for children, along with a note. "Your grandfather loved to look at the stars. He believed they held all the answers. Maybe you'll find some of your own." He started attending their school events, but always on Ilara's terms. He didn't arrive in a flashy car. He drove a simple sedan and parked down the street. He sat in the very back of the auditorium for the school play, a solitary figure watching his daughter Chloe paint a backdrop on stage. He didn't approach them. He just watched, a ghost content to remain in the shadows, simply bearing witness to the lives he had created. He was learning that being a father was not about possession or control, but about presence, even a distant, repentant presence. His redemption was not a destination. It was a long, arduous road, walked one quiet, emotionally intelligent step at a time. He was not trying to win back his family. He was trying, for the first time, to become a man worthy of having one. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet letters, distant observation, and the slow, arduous work of dismantling an empire built on a lie. Julian had methodically extricated himself from the day-to-day operations of Thorn Industries, ceding control to a new CEO and a revamped board. He poured his energy and his remaining fortune into the Arthur Initiative, which was quietly changing the lives of dozens of creators. He had, in a sense, become his father's posthumous partner. His relationship with his children had evolved from non-existent to a fragile, tentative connection. He had graduated from sitting in the back of auditoriums to supervised visits in a public park, always with Ilara present, a watchful but no longer hostile guardian. He learned that Noah had his own boisterous laugh, that Chloe had a fierce, protective love for her brothers, and that Liam possessed a quiet, unnerving intelligence that saw right through any pretense. He never tried to buy their affection. He learned to listen. He learned to be present. It was a fragile piece, an ecosystem of healing that was about to be subjected to the ultimate stress test. A rival tech conglomerate, a company run by a man whose ruthlessness mirrored Julian's own former self, had been digging. They had found a disgruntled former associate of Arthur Thorne, a man who knew the truth about the workshop fire and the stolen prototype. An exposé was imminent. Not a tabloid piece, but a meticulously documented investigation that would be presented to the Patent Office and the SEC. It was a corporate kill shot, designed to invalidate Thorn Industries' core patents and send the company into a death spiral. Julian's lawyers, the old guard who had helped him build his fortress, descended on the estate. The solution they presented was as brilliant as it was monstrous. They had dug into Arthur Thorne's life. They found evidence of his financial struggles, his occasional bouts with depression. They could build a narrative. They would paint Arthur as an unstable, incompetent tinkerer who was bitter about his son's success. They would preemptively discredit him, portraying him as a charlatan whose claims were the ramblings of a failed and troubled man. They could protect the company, protect the shareholders, protect what was left of the Thorne name. All Julian had to do was sign off on the strategy. All he had to do was destroy his father a second time. He sat in his cavernous boardroom, the same room where he had once plotted market takeovers, and listened to their plan. The lawyers were confident, their voices sharp and clinical. This was war, and truth was the first casualty. As they spoke, Julian looked at the far end of the table where Alara sat. He had asked her to be there, not as his ex-wife, but as the executor of his conscience. She had said nothing, her hands resting calmly on the polished table, her gaze fixed on him. This was the test. Everything he had done for the past 2 years, the foundation, the letters, the quiet presence in his children's lives, it all led to this moment. Was his transformation real, or was it just another more sophisticated form of crisis management? In the end, when the chips were down, would he choose the money or the memory? The lie that sustained an empire, or the truth that honored a father? He thought of Liam and the first edition book on astrophysics. He thought of his father's journal, of the love and fear in those elegant, looping words. He thought of what it would mean to stand on his father's grave and call him a liar to save a company that was already a monument to his own sins. "No," Julian said, his voice quiet but absolute. The lead lawyer stopped mid-sentence. "No, Julian, you're not understanding the stakes." "I understand the stakes perfectly," Julian interrupted, his eyes meeting Alara's across the long table. "For the first time in my life, I actually do." He stood up. "There will be no smear campaign. We will not be issuing a denial." He took a deep breath. "We will be issuing a press release, a full and complete confession, and we will be holding a press conference. I will be the one to tell the world that the foundation of this company was built on the work of my father, Arthur Thorne. A brilliant man I wronged in every conceivable way." The lawyers stared at him aghast. It was corporate suicide. It was financial immolation. "You're going to lose everything," his oldest legal counsel said, his voice a horrified whisper. Julian looked at Alara, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something beyond pity or sadness in her eyes. It was respect. "I already lost everything that mattered a long time ago," Julian said. "I'm just starting to try and earn some of it back." The press conference was a global event. Julian Thorne, the fallen titan, stood at a simple podium, not in a suit, but in a simple shirt and trousers. He looked older, tired, but the haunted, paranoid look in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a calm, settled clarity. He told the whole story. He didn't spare himself. He detailed his youthful greed, his callous dismissal of his father's genius, and the lie he had perpetuated for 2 decades. He announced that Thorne Industries would be voluntarily opening its patents and creating a public trust, with a significant percentage of all future profits to be funneled directly into the Arthur Initiative, ensuring that the legacy would now belong to all creators. He concluded by announcing his permanent resignation from any and all roles associated with the company. He was letting it go, all of it. He walked off that stage with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the truth he had finally chosen to carry. He had been given a choice between his father's memory and his father's stolen empire. He chose his father. It was the final, most profound act of his redemption, a public sacrifice that proved his transformation was not for show, but for the soul. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast a long, golden light across a small, tidy workshop that smelled of sawdust, metal, and brewing coffee. The space was filled not with corporate logos and sleek monitors, but with half-finished inventions, blueprints spread across wooden tables and tools that were worn and well used. It was a place of quiet, joyful creation. It was Arthur Thorne's dream, reborn. Julian, now a man whose face was etched with the lines of someone who had lived and learned, looked up from the intricate clockwork mechanism he was tinkering with as Alara walked in. She carried a basket filled with apples, her expression serene and content. Their relationship had found a new, unwritten definition. It was not a rekindled romance. The scars of the past were too deep for that. It was something quieter, more profound. A partnership in parenting, a friendship forged in the fires of truth and forgiveness, not a spoken forgiveness, but one that was lived day by day. Thorne Industries had survived, transformed. It was a smaller, more ethical company now, known more for its philanthropic trust than its market dominance. The name Thorne was no longer synonymous with ruthless ambition, but with a strange public story of downfall and atonement. The children, now vibrant, intelligent teenagers, were thriving. They had a father, not the distant, mythical mogul, but the man who came to their soccer games, who helped Chloe build the sets for her high school plays, and who spent hours in this very workshop with Liam, debating physics and building small, wondrous machines. He had finally learned that a legacy wasn't an empire to be defended, but a connection to be nurtured. Noah forgot his calculus textbook, Alara said, placing the basket on a clear corner of a workbench. Again. Julian chuckled, a warm, easy sound. The boy has a mind for chaos theory. The orderly world of calculus can't contain him. He wiped his hands on a rag. I'll run it over to the school. As he prepared to leave, Alara picked up a small framed photo from his desk. It was the school picture he had requested all those years ago. Next to it was the faded photo of his father. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Losing it all?" Julian paused at the door, looking back at the workshop, at the gentle hum of his small, meaningful life. He thought of the glass tower, the suffocating weight of the lies, the constant gnawing fear. He looked at Alara, the woman who had not destroyed him, but had, in her own powerful way, saved him by forcing him to save himself. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "I didn't lose anything that was ever truly mine, and I gained this." His gesture encompassed the workshop, the quiet peace, the unspoken understanding between them, the love for the children he was finally, truly, a father to. He didn't need her to say, "I forgive you." Her presence here, in this workshop built on the foundation of his father's honored memory, was forgiveness enough. It was an acknowledgement that he had become the man Arthur had always hoped he would be, the man she had once believed in back in the garage. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Go on," she said. "Your son is waiting." He nodded, and as he walked out into the crisp autumn air, he felt not the weight of a fallen empire, but the lightness of a man who had finally found his true inheritance. It wasn't in a stock portfolio or a brand name. It was in the simple, profound act of being present, of living in the truth, and of knowing that the most valuable legacy you can ever leave is the love you were brave enough to earn. The story lingered, not as a drama of wealth and revenge, but as a quiet, resonant lesson that a soul, no matter how lost, can always find its way home, not by building higher walls, but by finally having the courage to tear them down.